la prossima lezione e in realtà tutta la prossima lezione è nel segno di una nuova collaborazione del Salone Internazionale del Libro di Torino con appunto la Fondazione Collegio Carlo Alberto, che ringraziamo, e in particolare nella persona di Giorgio Barba Navaretti. Anche questo, come la collaborazione con il Davide Donatello di cui abbiamo parlato ieri, è una collaborazione che poi andrà avanti, speriamo, nei prossimi mesi, nei prossimi anni, e appunto abbiamo introdotto da Annamaria Testa Richard Baldwin. Richard Baldwin è un economista statunitense che appunto interverrà sul binomio uomo-macchina. La vita dell'uomo si sta rimodellando con grande rapidità a causa dell'intelligenza artificiale e dell'automazione, una rivoluzione che avrà conseguenze sul lavoro, sulla cultura, di una portata mai vista, soprattutto il Covid forse potrebbe essere un acceleratore di tutto questo, nel bene e nel male. Ecco, questo lo spiega uno dei più autorevoli studiosi in materia. Lui è professore al MIT e alla Columbia University, e quindi grazie alla Fondazione Collegio Carlo Alberto e appunto a Giorgio Barba Navaretti che la presiede, introdotto da Annamaria Testa, abbiamo appunto il piacere sul binomio uomo-macchina di avere appunto per il Salone del Libro, per Vita Nova, Richard Baldwin. Può andare alla lezione. Grazie.
Richard Baldwin è un economista molto reputato, insegna a Ginevra. Si è occupato di globalizzazione, il fenomeno pervasivo che ha cambiato le regole economiche e commerciali dell'intero pianeta, ha cambiato i rapporti di potere e di politica tra gli stati, ha influito sulle vite di tutti noi a livello culturale, sociale, economico, sanitario. Baldwin ora tira fuori un altro bel problemone con cui dovremo misurarci nei prossimi tempi, e lo fa con un libro che si intitola Rivoluzione globotica ed è pubblicato dal Mulino. Di che si tratta? L'espansione e il potenziamento dell'intelligenza artificiale procedono in maniera rapidissima, e l'intelligenza artificiale sta cominciando a entrare negli uffici e cambierà completamente le regole del nostro lavoro. Non c'è nulla da che vedere con quanto è successo in passato nelle fabbriche, prima con l'avvento del vapore e della meccanizzazione, poi con la catena di montaggio fordista. Questa volta a darci di mezzo sono i colletti bianchi, perché l'intelligenza artificiale diventerà molto velocemente molto più brava degli esseri umani a fare tutti i compiti che sono prevedibili e ripetitivi. Per esempio cercare e organizzare i dati, per esempio fare ricerche legali, per esempio fare diagnosi mediche a partire da sintomatologie codificate, per esempio scrivere articoli di finanza o di borsa per una testata economica. Dobbiamo preoccuparci, dobbiamo prepararci e dobbiamo sapere che per convivere con l'automazione, con l'intelligenza artificiale, dobbiamo sviluppare le nostre capacità che riguardano ciò che le macchine per ora e in un futuro anche non così prossimo non riusciranno a fare. Dobbiamo sviluppare l'intuizione, il pensiero creativo, la capacità di ragionare in maniera autonoma e indipendente. Guardate e ascoltate.
Welcome to my talk on the globotics upheaval. This is a book I finished in 2019, the early part, way before COVID, and it's about globalization, robotics, and the future of work. Now, what I'd like to start out with is kind of a little diagram or a slide which encapsulates the main points I want to make with this book. So you see here, the big gray arrow, that's digital technology. And digital technology, as we all know, is advancing at an incredibly fast pace. And this big arrow is launching two other smaller arrows, the blue ones, which is automation and globalization. And one of my key points, and why I called the book Globotics, is because automation and globalization is happening at the same time. In other words, globalization and robotics are being launched at the same time by digital technology. Now, the second key point here is that this automation and this globalization is coming for white collar and professional jobs, not manufacturing jobs as it has for the past 25 years. Moreover, because of the digital technology aspects of it, I think this is coming faster than most think and in ways few expect. So that's the basic messages I want to get across today. And I want to explain the logic of why I think this is going to happen and why I think it's going to happen so fast. So before I get started, though, let me just admit that what we're talking about is the future. And the future is unknowable, but it's also inevitable. And because of that, I feel that economists like myself, who don't normally feel comfortable talking about the future because we don't have any data, I think we have an obligation to think about the future, to use our special knowledge to think about what the future of work might be like. Because the worst way to think about the future is to pretend it's going to be just like today. So with that caveat in mind, and remember, I often sound like I believe everything I'm saying, but deep down I know that it's about the future, so you can't know it. This is just conjectures and educated guesses, hopefully sparking your thinking about what will actually happen. So let me start with some definitions. So globotics, that's a word in the title. And really what globotics is globalization plus robotics smashed together into an ugly but hopefully memorable word. Now, when I talk about globalization here, I'm talking about telemigration for the most part. And what I mean by that is working from home when home is abroad. And I'd like you to think about that as RI, which is remote intelligence. And when I talk about robotics, I'm not mostly going to be talking about industrial robots, what you see pictures of all the time. I'm talking about white-collar robots, which are really software that automates certain human service tasks. And I'd like you to think of that as AI. And I want to keep this contrast between RI, remote intelligence, and AI, artificial intelligence, going because it's digital technology pushing both at the same time, affecting the same jobs. Now, telemigration, what is that? Before COVID, I used to have to show people videos to explain what I'm talking about this, especially in Europe, where telecommuting wasn't so, or telework wasn't so common. But now, of course, everybody knows what it is. We're all doing this at home. It's basically, but telemigration is when people are sitting in one nation and working in offices in another. It's basically telecommuting, but from a different country, or working from home when home is abroad, as I like to say it. And this telemigration has a high end right now and a low end. So for instance, there is a low end where, for example, if you want a logo designed, you can send it off to you can go through one of these internet platforms and find somebody to design a logo for, say, 50 euros. That's not very sophisticated. And it's even gets less sophisticated if you want somebody to, say, type in a whole bunch of data or match receipts to expenses in a Excel spreadsheet. You can get somebody to do that online. But there's also a high end of telemigration where, for example, people are doing event management or managing IT systems or helping you with HR when they're from abroad. So these are real professional jobs being done by people sitting abroad. So telemigration is providing competition to service sector workers, both at the low end and the high end. Now, when it comes to robotics, I want to talk about white-collar robots. So I call them white-collar robots to distinguish sharply in your mind from the usual picture of what a robot is, which is something that's scary or made out of metal, and it's definitely working in a factory or it's doing something physical. White-collar robots are really kind of an automation process that happens through software. Now, the low end of one of the most important low-end aspects of white-collar robots is called robotic process automation, or RPA. And if you've never heard of RPA, look it up because it's changing the way offices work all over the world. It's growing relatively rapidly. It's done at a very low level, so it doesn't cause much concern. A lot of people don't know about it, but it's very, very important. And what it's doing is replacing relatively repetitive jobs. So for example, when I launched my book in the United States in 2019, I was traveling there for 2 weeks. And so I wanted to change the subscription on my cell phone to have local calls in the United States. So what I did was I sent an email to my provider, which is Swisscom, and somebody, a human at Swisscom, opened up my emails, read what I wanted, opened up the subscription database, changed my subscription to include local calls in the United States, closed that database, then opened up the billing database and changed my billing correspondingly, shut that database, and then moved on to the next thing. What RPA does is exactly that, using exactly the same tools, but it does it 100 times faster. And as long as it's read the email correctly, it does it without error. And the key to this whole thing is now with artificial intelligence, they've trained models that can open up an email and decide what actually is in that email. So that was the big breakthrough. And then they automate all this kind of information processing jobs. That's at the low end. Now at the higher end, there are a bunch of robots, like IBM has Watson. There's another one called Amelia. A lot of banks have them, like Rachel from Bank of America. But what these are really sophisticated artificial intelligence platforms, which also have some input out and output capacities. For instance, natural language processing. So you can talk to them on the phone and they understand what you're saying, and then they react appropriately. And that some of them can generate speech as well. So it's as if you're talking with this robot or writing or whatever. So these white collar robots are automating a higher level of job. Just to give you some example, in law, in the United States, there's a big process of what's called discovery. And that is where two parties in a civil complaint have evidence and they have to exchange the evidence with each other so it's a fair trial. And a typical thing is that one of the parties will give millions of emails and tons of paper to the other one to kind of bury them in paper. And now what they do in law firms in the United States is they feed that all into a computer and they have a computer digest it and see what's going on. That's called e-discovery. So instead of using young lawyers to read through all these things and make summaries, they just feed it into a high-end computer software robot and therefore arrive at a database that, say, a senior partner can question or look at. Same thing happens for financial accounting, for looking for fraud or looking for inconsistencies in legal contracts, or, for instance, writing marketing reports. Some newspapers use robo-writers to write up, for example, the stock market prices and all those sorts of things. So the white-collar robots are also at a high end, essentially substituting for some of the work done by professionals, not just low-end office workers. Okay, now what I want to do is point out that COVID changes things in 4 important ways. So first of all, lots of people have been fired already. And that matters because once companies have fired or let go workers, they no longer face the cost of doing that. So when they come to hire people back, they will have already paid the cost of dismissal, whatever those costs are. And so they'll be freer in choosing to offshore the job through telemigration or to automate the job through software robots. The second thing is that COVID forced an emergency digital transformation that will be lasting and massive. In other words, it's got us all online. Well, workers have learned how to work together in remote teams. Managers have learned how to manage those teams. Customers have learned how to take delivery of services online when before they would have insisted with in-service presence. The companies have invested in secure cloud-based solutions so that they can keep their data secure. They've also invested in lots of equipment and bandwidth so people, their workers, can work remotely. Now, all those investments are not going away. And although lots of people will come back to the office, as we did this summer, many people went back to the office and now are back at home. But still, not everybody did, and lots of people will be commuting then as they were before. Now that, of course, is opening the door to offshoring the jobs. Number three is social distancing raises the cost of in-person workers compared to white-collar workers and telemigrants. And for instance, my bank here in Switzerland, which is Credit Suisse, they have an A team, B team thing going on. This was in the summer when they were still going back to the office. So only half the people would go into the office one week and half the other week. And so in essence, office space has gotten more scarce or more expensive. And so if they're thinking about substituting some workers for telemigrants or software robots, this is a good opportunity to do it because they'll save some office space in doing that. And these social distancing requirements will be with us through a lot of the economic recovery when people are deciding to hire back with humans or with GloBots. And the fourth thing is that firms are under extreme cost pressure. They already were because of the first wave. They had to take on lots of debt and the revenue went down. But with the second wave, they're getting even more debt under even more cost pressure. So they'll be very eager to look for cost savings and therefore more interested in GloBots, globalization of the service sector, or these white collar robots than they were before. So that's how COVID has changed things. Basically, same trends, but accelerated them. Okay. By this time, if you've been paying attention, you may be saying, well, there's nothing different here. This is just service globalization, and it's automation of stuff we've seen for a long time. Now, what I want to do is argue in the next few slides that this time is really different. And what I've done is, in the process of convincing myself that it was different, I constructed a few bits of intellectual infrastructure or architecture that kind of points out why it's different. And that's what I'd like to share with you for the next few minutes. So the first point is that this is affecting service and professional jobs, not just factory jobs. Now, factory workers have known all about automation and globalization. They've been competing with China abroad and robots at home for decades. There's nothing new for them, and it will continue. But many people in the service sector have been sheltered from globalization because in many service sector jobs, face-to-face is very important. And in fact, if it had not been for COVID, we would never even have thought to provide some of these services online. But that shielded them from wage competition from foreign workers sitting abroad. Moreover, since computers couldn't really think or needed very talented humans to help them think, most office and professional workers were protected from automation of their jobs, especially people at the higher ends, professional workers. Now, that is a big difference. For one thing, 80 to 90% of the people in our economies work in the service sector. Only something like 10% work in the manufacturing sector. So the fact that this automation and this globalization is going to disrupt the service sector is very important in determining its social impact. And that's why the second word in my title is upheaval. Okay. Now, another thing I'd like to distinguish is that digitech is like information and communication technology. In other words, digital technology is not really new. It's been with us for a couple decades now, but there's a big difference. When information and communication technology is applied to manufacturing, as it was in the past, say, 25 years, it was mostly applied to physical processes with only little bits of information and communication. But when digitech is applied to services, it's mostly information and communication and only little bits of physical. And what that means is that the physics, which is constraining the speed at which it can happen, is different. In the past 25 years, it's been the physics of matter which constrained how fast this could go. Going forward, it's the physics of electrons and photons which are constraining it. And those two are very, very different. So let me just give you a concrete example of that. To double the flows of imports and exports of goods requires about 2 decades for most countries. But the flows of information across borders doubles about every 2 years when it comes to information and services. So you see, if you're thinking about the world as if it will take 2 decades to double the flows of things that cross borders, when in fact it's going to be doubling every 2 years, you're using the wrong physics. You're misthinking how fast this thing can come. Number 3, today's artificial intelligence is different. In 2019, 2020, computers can read, write, see, speak, understand speech, create visual output, recognize subtle patterns, but in 2015 they couldn't. So what changed? My argument is that the programming is different. Before, when we taught computers to do things, we used coding. Now, when we teach computers to do things, we often use machine learning. Now, what I'd like to do is establish an analogy between thinking slow and thinking fast, and coding and machine learning. Now, thinking slow, thinking fast, that's the words that Daniel Kahneman, who got a Nobel Prize in economics, talks about the 2 ways that humans think. So thinking slow is what most of us call thinking. It's effortful. It's like doing arithmetic. It's difficult. You know you're doing it. But most importantly, you know how you do it, logical by logical step. And therefore, in the old days, you could write a computer program, a code, to teach a computer to do it. Now, thinking fast is instinctual things, unconscious things, like recognizing objects very quickly, or walking down uneven stairs and not falling down. But these are things which you are unconscious thinking, usually. It happens extremely fast, but most importantly is we do not know how we do it. And therefore, we could not, using computer programming, teach a computer to do it. But now what we do is we teach computers to do things with machine learning, which means we take a very large data set of examples, structured data set where the question is clear and the answers are clear, and we estimate a very large statistical model to make guesses. So whether it's facial recognition or natural language processing or machine translation, we estimate a model to make guesses of inputs and say what is on the output. Now, the point about this is it gave computers a whole set of cognitive capacities that they did not have very recently, say about 2016. Now, some of those cognitive capacities like natural language, reading, writing, recognizing objects, facial recognition, those are useful in the workplace, and they've opened the door to automate a whole series of service sector tasks which previously could not be because computers couldn't do those things. Now they can, and that's a big difference. Fourth, globotics is advancing at an explosive pace of digitech. The past transformations were much slower, and that will matter, I think, in terms of the impact on society and our government's ability to help us adjust to these things. That's another reason why upheaval is in there. I think it's going to come so fast that it'll cause social disruption. Okay, now there's many ways of explaining how fast digital technology comes. You know, there's exponential curves and stuff, but what I want to use today is as an analogy. So what I want to do is remind you about Apollo 11. Apollo 11 was the first mission that put a man on the moon back in 1969. Now that spacecraft was guided from the Earth to the moon by one of the largest, most powerful supercomputers on Earth at the time. Now, it was an amazing thing what it could do. I remember distinctly when I saw the guy step on the moon. It was absolutely astounding, unbelievable that they could guide this spacecraft all the way to the moon and back, and nothing went wrong, or nobody died anyways. Now, all of you will have cell phones, for example, like this one here, an iPhone. And if you look at, for instance, at the power of an iPhone 6 processing power, which came out in 2015, it's 126 million times faster than the mainframe that guided the Apollo 11 to the moon and back in 1969, which is amazing, 126 million. That's outrageously large. But the key point in understanding how explosive it is to look what happened between the iPhone 6S and the iPhone 10. The iPhone 10 came out in 2017, and it is 2.5 times more powerful than the iPhone 6S. Now, if you think about it, that means that there was more increase in processing speed between 2015 and 2017 than there was between 1969 and 2015. And that keeps going. Every 2 years, it keeps doubling. So the actual increments in processing speed and capacities are increasing at mind-blowing speeds. And that's one of the reasons that people are not very good at understanding how fast this is coming. So another point is that automation and globalization are happening together. I mentioned that at the very beginning. And this is different because in the past transformations, the big ones, automation started long before globalization. So when automation meant mechanization, like steam power started being used industrially in England in 1720, but steam power didn't really revolutionize globalization until a century later, around 1820, when you could put it on wheels and on boats and therefore lower the cost of moving goods. And when it came to ICT, the computer on a chip was developed in 1973, and that started revolutionizing automation of factory jobs. They put a computer on a chip on a robot arm, and it could do all sorts of things. And it wasn't till about 1990 that the same kind of technology revolutionized globalization and led to the new globalization, outsourcing, and all that sort of stuff. This time, it's happening together. Okay, so it's coming faster than most believe because of this exponential curve. And we have a name for it. We call it digital disruption. Now, let me move on to the next topic, which is it's coming in ways few expect. I'd like you to think about tasks, not occupations. Now, the point here is that many jobs will go, but few occupations. So there's a lot of misthinking about AI and offshoring, because people think it's like, okay, we can a computer can do one thing, pretty soon it'll take over the whole job. But I think it's more apt to think about how tractors changed the job of farming. So tractors changed how every farmer works. And it does mean we need fewer farmers than we did before to grow the same food. But tractors did not replace farmers fully. And I think that's the same way it will be. Very few occupations will be untouched by this because lots of things in each occupation can be replaced by telemigrants or software robots, but very few occupations can be entirely replaced by it. The second is that it won't look like a factory closure. In other words, in manufacturing, when something goes wrong, Fiat shuts down an entire factory or Renault shuts down a factory, it's a tragedy for hundreds or thousands of people working in that factory, and that makes the newspaper and everybody knows about it. This one won't work that way. It'll be replacing one worker at a time, one job loss at a time. Many people will be reemployed, but in a downgraded kind of way. There won't be mass unemployment in the Rust Belt style, like we saw in the Midwest of the United States. It'll just be that people will have to change jobs, and lots of people will have more precarious jobs. So I think it's like the iPhone infiltration. Think about how smartphones came into your lives. You know, just 10 years ago, useful, but every single year, there was more tricks, more useful things. And as a consequence, we integrated smartphones into our personal lives, into our family lives, into our business lives. It even changed the way we relate with our cities in physical ways, with the maps and things like that. But the point of what I want to make here is that people didn't know it was happening while it was happening, because there were so many seemingly small, seemingly unrelated decisions that completely transformed the way we interact as societies and economies because of smartphones. And I think Globots will come into our workplaces in the same kind of subtle, unnoticed way until it really gets going. And then we'll say, oh, how do we get along without them? Okay. Now, one other thing which I'd like to talk about is this job displacement, job replacement kind of discussion. So, and I'd like to point out that the artificial intelligence and the telemigration, the offshoring, the business model of all that is displacing jobs. So digital technology is being trained to take over certain tasks that workers now are doing. They are not being used to create lots of new jobs. Human ingenuity is driving the job creation. But the key point here is digital technology is moving at this explosive pace and therefore displacing or changing jobs at an explosive pace. And human ingenuity is creating new jobs. But human ingenuity is more of a straight line thing, whereas the exponential growth is more of this explosive thing. So at least in the short run, I don't know how long that is, a few years, 5 years, 10 years, the displacement may outstrip the job creation. And remember, I'm not talking about people being naked unemployed. It's just they're being displaced and having to find other ways to do things, going into the gig economy or whatever. So future globalization. In my last couple of minutes, I'd like to talk about future globalization, above all of migration, telemigration. So for a variety of reasons that I talk about more explicitly in the book, I think this idea that low-cost, talented workers sitting abroad will start to compete for jobs in rich countries will be the big trend of the 2020s. So if you want an analogy, in the 1990s, when India and China in particular joined the world market, hundreds of millions of talented, low-cost manufacturing workers joined the world economy. And that made a big impact on industry in the rich countries, very disruptive in certain regions. I think the same thing is going to happen in the 2020s, but in the service sector, and it'll involve middle-class people in middle-income countries, places like South Africa, Pakistan, Ukraine, India, Philippines, etc. And there will be this tsunami of talent coming in and therefore disrupting the service sector, very much like the tsunami of talent disrupted manufacturing in the 1990s. Okay, and in the last minute and a half, what I'd like to talk about is the future of work in the long run. So let's say, we get past this, we have all the jobs we need because human ingenuity created it eventually. What will those jobs look like? Now, we cannot know the names of them, just like in the past transformations when we went from farms to factories, and then when we went from factories to offices, we didn't know the names of the jobs. We had to wait for an entrepreneur to create things that we needed. But we can think about what the jobs will be like. Now here, I'd like to suggest that we use a process of elimination. And here's my guideline. Globots will do what they can because they'll be so cheap. We will do what Globots can't. So when you want to think about the future of work, what you have to ask yourself is, what can't Globots do? In other words, what can't artificial intelligence do, and what can't telemigrants do, remote intelligence do? So the first thing is AI. So for a variety of reasons, which I write about extensively in my book, AI can't do humans. To a large extent, it's because you can't get the structured data sets on most human behavior. Things like ethics, creativity, curiosity, motivating large groups of people, understanding group dynamics, those sorts of things that AI can't do. So the jobs of the future, whatever they are, will require doing lots of very human tasks. And when you think about remote intelligence or telemigrants, the only thing that they can't do is actually be in the room. Now, what that means that the jobs of the future, whatever they are, will involve people in the same room. Otherwise, the job would be offshored or in the room with, say, equipment or something like that. So for me, the future of work is actually a happy place. The jobs of the future will be more human and more local. Because of the productivity gains, will be richer and hopefully more generous society, but we have to manage the transition. So for me, it's really a matter of speed differential, displacement, and creation in the short run that we have to manage in order to get to this better future. So I'll stop right there. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy the book.
E grazie a Richard Baldwin, speriamo che abbia ragione Richard Baldwin, cioè che i posti di lavoro che perderemo saranno rimpiazzati da altri posti di lavoro, e a quel punto però sarà anche da vedere, perché forse lì è l'altro grande discrimine, come verrà ridistribuita la ricchezza, perché poi è sempre anche una questione di giustizia sociale, ma quello dipende anche, insomma, dipende anche da noi. Grazie a Richard Baldwin, interessantissima questa lezione. È finita anche questa giornata di Vita Nova, il progetto del Salone Internazionale del Libro di Torino, che con queste bellissime lezioni ci accompagnerà fino all'8 e poi fino al 6 di gennaio per spendere i buoni da leggere che appunto potete andare che ritirerete, state ritirando su Salone Salto Più, la piattaforma del Salone del Libro che trovate sul nostro sito internet e che sono spendibili nelle librerie torinesi che aderiscono all'iniziativa. E io insomma vi do appuntamento a domani alle 11, ci sarà il Silent Book Contest, Gianni De Conro Award, e poi a partire dalle 18:30 avremo le lezioni di domani. Ci sarà Romeo Castellucci, Fumetti Brutti, Manuel Vilas e Pier Giorgio Odifreddi. A domani con Vita Nova, a domani con il Salone Internazionale del Libro di Torino.
Energia. Solo cambiando il modo di guardare le cose che guardiamo inizieranno a cambiare. In Eni oggi catturiamo anidride carbonica coltivando delle microalghe che diventano prodotti di nuova generazione. Ma non basta. Per fare davvero la differenza abbiamo bisogno di Lorenzo, che invece di disfarsi degli oggetti li riutilizza per creare qualcosa di nuovo. Perché Eni più Lorenzo è meglio di Eni. Eni, insieme abbiamo un'altra energia.